For one suspended moment, everyone simply stared as though the body might rearrange itself into something reasonable if given time. The polished staircase, so recently admired, seemed to hold its breath along with the room. Then sound returned in a rush, skirts swishing, chairs scraping, someone dropping a teacup with a thin, shocked crack. A woman near the hall table pressed both hands to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the man's face as if she recognized him but could not accept the recognition. "Don't touch him." Lady Alderney's voice rang out, higher than usual, brittle with authority and fear. She stood 2 steps back from the bottom stair, one gloved hand lifted as though she could physically hold the scene in place. Her pearls rose and fell too quickly against her throat. Miss Marple did not move forward. She had learned long ago that in the first moments after a calamity, people revealed themselves before they remembered to be wise. She stayed where she was, close enough to see, far enough to be ignored, an elderly lady with a knitting bag, expression of mild distress, and the air of someone who had come only for sponge cake and harmless conversation. The man's tweed coat was dark at the shoulders from the damp air outside, and his hair, neatly combed before, now lay in a careless spill across his forehead. His eyes were half open. His right hand had skidded on the floorboards, leaving a faint smear in the shine, as if the polish itself had become a thin film of treachery. The banister carved oak, worn smooth by generations, was just beyond his grasp. "It's Mr. Pritchard," someone whispered, and the name travelled like a spark through dry grass. From London. The one Lady Alderney said was coming for the tour. "Pritchard," repeated another voice with sharp interest. What on earth was he doing here? Lady Alderney's lips tightened. Was an antiquarian, a specialist. He was to advise me on the restoration of the gallery. Good heavens, breathed Mrs. Bantry, who had appeared as if conjured by scandal, her hat slightly askew from haste. "Jane, did you see him fall?" Miss Marple allowed her gaze to lift, not to the body, but to the stairs. The steps shone so brightly that the reflections made them seem wet, like river stones. On the landing above, as she had noticed at once, there was the mark of a shoe, not a dramatic muddy print, not a bold smear, just the faint scuff of a sole that had pressed into the newly waxed surface and dulled it. "No," Miss Marple said gently, as though answering a question about the weather. "I heard the scream, and then, well, there he was." The scream had come from the doorway. Miss Marple's eyes drifted there now. A young woman stood rigidly beside the open front door, one hand still clutching the brass handle. Her cheeks were blotched, her pupils wide, as if she had opened onto something that should not exist in daylight. She wore a pale blue coat and a practical hat pinned a touch too severely, suggesting either a careful nature or a desperate attempt at control. "That's Edith," murmured Mrs. Bantry in Miss Marple's direction, as if offering a name was a form of comfort. "Lady Alderney's secretary. Poor girl, she always looks as though she expects trouble." Edith's gaze flicked upward, not to the stairs as everyone else's did, but to Lady Alderney. There was something in the look an appeal, or a warning, or perhaps a silent question. Miss Marple felt the smallest prickle of interest. People who found bodies usually looked at the bodies. People who feared something else looked at the living. "Someone fetch Dr. Haydock," Lady Alderney commanded, "and call the police. This is dreadful, absolutely dreadful." "Police," echoed Mrs. Price Ridley, with a strange little brightness, as though the word itself were a stimulant. "It must have been an accident, surely. These stairs are like glass." "Why, I said only this morning, didn't I, Mr. Hartley, that someone would break their neck if they weren't careful." Mr. Hartley, a tall man with a theatrical moustache and the air of being constantly misjudged, nodded vigorously. "Most unsafe. Frankly, Lady Alderney, I don't know why you insist on making it so slippery. We're not in some grand hotel, after all." Lady Alderney's face flushed. "Because it is my house, Mr. Hartley. And now it's a death trap," Mrs. Price Ridley said, not unkindly, simply as one might remark upon the weather turning. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Price Ridley's hands. They were clasped at her waist, but her fingers were busy, worrying at a ring, twisting it around and around as though she could polish anxiety into submission. Miss Marple's own fingers itched in sympathy for her knitting needles. Habit was a kind of confession. Across the hall, Colonel Hardwicke had stationed himself near the foot of the stairs like a man defending a position. "Nobody goes up," he barked, his tone suggesting he was used to giving orders that were obeyed. "Not until the doctor says so." Not a soul. "And what about the shoe mark?" blurted a woman in a lilac cardigan, leaning forward as though she had spotted a clue in a penny dreadful. "Someone was up there just now." "That could be from earlier," snapped Edith suddenly, her voice sharper than her small frame suggested. Everyone turned to her. She swallowed, then tried again in a more acceptable tone. The staff were carrying trays and moving things. Someone could have stepped there before the tour began. Lady Alderney made a small, helpless motion. "Edith, don't." But Edith's eyes stayed fixed on the landing, as if she could feel that scuffed spot like a bruise. Miss Marple noted it, as she noted everything, the way Edith's fingers tightened on the door handle, the fact that her coat was buttoned wrong, one button off, suggesting haste, the faint sheen on her cheeks that wasn't tears but sweat. A maid appeared from the corridor, pale and trembling, and another behind her. One of them held a silver tray, forgotten, with cups that rattled softly. The maid's gaze dropped to the body and sprang away as if burned. "Oh, Lord," she whispered, and made the sign of the cross with fingers that shook. "Go to the kitchen," Lady Alderney said, her voice softening as she addressed the staff. "Make tea, and send someone to the village to fetch Dr. Haydock at once." The maid turned and fled, almost running, tray tilting dangerously. Another maid followed, but slower, her eyes darting once more to the stairs before she disappeared. Miss Marple caught the look. Not fear of the corpse, fear of the staircase. Fear of what might be found if someone looked too closely. Mrs. Bantry stepped nearer to Miss Marple, lowering her voice. "Jane, it's horrible, isn't it? 1 minute we're admiring the wax. The next—" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, her tone mild. 1 minute one is admiring how bright something is, and the next one notices how easily it shows marks." Mrs. Bantry blinked, as though she had not quite understood, and then a fresh ripple of commotion ran through the hall as Dr. Haydock himself arrived, breathless and impatient, pushing through the crowd with that brisk disbelief he always wore like armor against village drama. "Move aside," he said, "let me see." The villagers parted, eager and reluctant at once. Dr. Haydock knelt, 2 fingers pressed to Mr. Pritchard's throat, his mouth tightening as the seconds passed. He looked up, and even before he spoke, the room knew. "He's dead," Dr. Haydock said shortly. Then, after a moment, his eyes flicked to the stairs, to the gleam, to the faint smear where a hand had slid. "And if he fell hard." Lady Alderney made a sound like a swallowed sob. Mrs. Price Ridley's ring turned faster. Edith's hand slipped from the door handle at last, and she stared down at her own fingers as though they were no longer hers. Dr. Haydock rose, brushing his knees as if the very act of touching death offended him. "Call Inspector Slack," he added, and there was no humor in the name. "And in the meantime, nobody touches anything. Not the body, not the stairs. Nothing." Miss Marple inclined her head obediently, like everyone else, but her eyes remained on the landing, on the dulled patch of shine where a shoe had been, and on the little smear below where desperation had tried to grip what could not be held. In a village, she thought, people always spoke of accidents as though accidents were impartial. Yet there were always those small choices where one stepped, how one hurried, what one wiped away that turned a polished surface into a weapon. The arrival of Inspector Slack brought with it a subtle change in the air, as though the house itself stiffened at the intrusion. He entered with the practiced stride of a man who had learned to assert authority before chaos could decide. To challenge him, his hat removed, but still held firmly, as if he might need it again at any moment. Behind him came a constable with a notebook already open, pen poised in anticipation. Inspector Slack took in the scene with quick, economical glances. The body at the foot of the stairs, Dr. Haydock standing a little apart with folded arms. Lady Alderney seated rigidly on a straight-backed chair, and the cluster of villagers who had drawn together as though warmth might be found in numbers. His gaze lingered a fraction longer on the staircase itself, polished to an almost unnatural brightness, before returning to the people. "All right," he said, his voice clipped but not unkind. "Let's have some space here. This isn't a spectacle." The villagers shuffled back obediently, though their eyes clung to the scene with unmistakable hunger. Miss Marple retreated with the others, settling herself on a small upholstered bench against the wall. From there, she had a clear view of the hall without appearing to seek one. Dr. Haydock spoke in low tones to the inspector, gesturing briefly toward the body and then toward the stairs. Inspector Slack nodded, his mouth pursed, before crouching to examine Mr. Pritchard more closely. He did not touch, merely observed, as though sight alone might tell him what he needed to know. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "Arthur Pritchard," Lady Alderney replied, her voice carefully composed. "An antiquarian. He was invited here in a professional capacity." "And you last saw him when?" "This morning. He arrived shortly before the fete began. We spoke in the drawing-room. He seemed quite normal." Inspector Slack straightened and turned to the constable. "Take down everyone's name. No one leaves until I've spoken to them." There was a collective murmur at that, not of protest exactly, but of mild offense. Mary Mead was not accustomed to being treated like a crime scene, and the villagers wore their respectability like a badge. Miss Marple noted how quickly that badge was adjusted, straightened, polished for inspection. Inspector Slack's attention shifted to Edith, who stood a little apart now, hands clasped in front of her as though she were awaiting judgment. "You found the body?" "Yes," Edith said. Her voice wavered only slightly. "I opened the door to let in some air. I saw him there." "At the foot of the stairs?" "Yes." "Did you hear anything before that?" Edith hesitated. "No. Only the music from the green. And then I screamed." Inspector Slack studied her face for a moment, then nodded and made a note. "You didn't touch anything?" "No." "Good." His gaze moved on, alighting next on Mrs. Price Ridley, who immediately stepped forward, with an eagerness that suggested she had been waiting for precisely this moment. "I do hope you'll note, Inspector," she began, "that I said from the start those stairs were dangerous. Anyone could have slipped." Inspector Slack held up a hand. "We'll come to opinions later, Mrs. Price Ridley." "Yes, later." Colonel Hardwicke cleared his throat. "If I may, Inspector, I was standing near the stairs at the time. Didn't see anyone push him. Didn't see anyone near him at all, in fact." Inspector Slack raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying he fell on his own?" "I'm saying I saw no foul play." Miss Marple watched Colonel Hardwicke as he spoke. His back was straight, his chin lifted, his words clipped and confident. Yet his eyes flicked just once to the landing above before returning to the inspector. It was the sort of glance a man made without realizing it, a habit rather than a choice. "And where were you standing exactly?" Inspector Slack asked. "Near the base of the stairs. I just finished explaining the history of the banister to a small group." "And you heard nothing?" "Nothing." Inspector Slack nodded again, though his expression suggested he was collecting more than answers. He moved on, speaking briefly to Mrs. Bantry, to Mr. Hartley, to a handful of others, establishing positions, timelines, small personal certainties. Each villager offered a version of events that placed them safely to one side of tragedy, witnesses to circumstance rather than participants in it. Miss Marple waited. She had learned patience early, in gardens and drawing rooms, where the most interest. Things were said when people believed they were finished speaking. At last, Inspector Slack's gaze settled on her. "And you, madam?" Miss Marple looked up with mild surprise, as though the notion of her importance had only just occurred to him. "Oh, I'm sure I can't be of much help," she said apologetically. "I was standing over there admiring the portraits." "But you heard the scream?" "Yes. And then I saw Mr. Pritchard lying there." Inspector Slack studied her face, perhaps expecting more. "You didn't see him fall?" "No." "Did you notice anyone on the stairs just before?" Miss Marple frowned faintly, as if consulting memory with some effort. Well, people were coming and going at such a narrow space. One doesn't always register who is where. Inspector Slack inclined his head, unconvinced but polite. Thank you. As he turned away, Miss Marple's gaze drifted once more to the staircase. The Polish caught the light in smooth, uninterrupted lines, except for that single dull mark on the landing. No one had approached it since the inspector's arrival. It sat there quietly, an interruption in perfection, much like the body below had interrupted the fate. A constable murmured something to Inspector Slack, who nodded and addressed the room again. Until we can determine otherwise, we're treating this as a possible accident. But accidents have a way of telling the truth if you listen carefully. There was a faint ripple of relief at that, though it did not reach everyone. Edith's shoulders remained tense. Lady Alderney stared fixedly at the stairs, as though she could will them to return to harmless wood and wax. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting bag and reflected, not for the first time, that in villages, accidents were often the stories people told themselves when the truth was too uncomfortable to examine closely. Yet a truth, like an overly polished surface, had a habit of revealing exactly where someone had stepped when they thought no one was looking. The hall slowly resumed its breath, though it did so unevenly, like a room after a long-held cough. Inspector Slack and the constable withdrew to one side with Dr. Haydock, their voices lowered, while the villagers clustered in small, instinctive groups. Conversation resumed in fragments, half-sentences, murmured theories, questions that were not meant to be answered aloud. Tea arrived, carried by the same trembling maid who had fled earlier, now steadied by routine if not by nerves. Cups were pressed into hands that shook too much to refuse them. Miss Marple accepted hers with gratitude and settled more firmly on the upholstered bench, her posture suggesting fatigue rather than alertness. It was astonishing, she reflected, how readily people forgot an elderly woman once she was seated and holding a teacup. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned toward Mrs. Bantry, lowering her voice with the exaggerated secrecy that guaranteed it would be overheard. "I always thought it odd," she murmured, "having a stranger poking about one's house. You never know what people are really after. An antiquarian is after antiques," Mrs. Bantry replied, though her tone suggested she herself was not entirely convinced of such simplicity. "Well," Mrs. Price Ridley persisted, "there are rumors about the Alderney family. Old things best left alone." Miss Marple sipped her tea and listened. Rumors, she knew, were the village's way of rehearsing truths it was not yet ready to admit. Near the doorway, Edith stood apart, her tea untouched. Mr. Hartley approached her with a sympathetic tilt of the head. "Nasty shock for you, my dear," he said. "You did very well." Edith's smile was faint and fleeting. "I only did what anyone would." Yes, of course." Mr. Hartley hesitated, then added, "You were inside all morning, weren't you?" Edith stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Yes." Miss Marple noted the exchange. The question slipped in as casually as sugar into tea. People asked such things not to gather facts, but to reassure themselves that answers existed. Colonel Hardwicke had stationed himself once more near the foot of the stairs, his presence suggesting vigilance rather than curiosity. A woman approached him, Mrs. Ellis, pale and fluttering. "Colonel, you're quite sure no one was near him?" "Quite," he said firmly. "If there had been, I'd have seen them." Mrs. Ellis nodded, visibly comforted by certainty, and moved on. Inspector Slack rejoined the room, his expression thoughtful. "We'll need to have a look upstairs," he announced. "Constable, cordon off the hall. No one else goes near the stairs." There was a soft chorus of assent. The villagers seemed relieved to be instructed. Direction offered the illusion of safety. As the constable set about his task, Miss Marple rose slowly as though stiff from sitting too long. She moved not toward the stairs, but toward the portrait-lined wall opposite them, peering at a painting of a long-dead Alderney matriarch with a politely critical eye. Such a stern expression, she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, who had drifted over. One gets the feeling she knew exactly what everyone was up to. Mrs. Bantry glanced nervously toward the inspector. "Jane, you shouldn't." "Oh, I'm only admiring the brushwork," Miss Marple said lightly, "though I do wonder sometimes whether houses like this remember more than people do." Mrs. Bantry shivered, despite herself. From her vantage point, Miss Marple could see the lower curve of the bast, the place where Mr. Pritchard's hand had missed its salvation. She could also see, just beyond it, the small side table where a vase of spring flowers had been placed for the fete. The vase had been nudged, she noticed, its base no longer centered on the lace mat beneath it. A trifle, perhaps, but trifles had a way of speaking. Inspector Slack climbed the stairs carefully, his steps deliberate, his eyes alert. He paused on the landing, crouched, and examined the dull scuff in the polish. The constable joined him, notebook out. Dr. Haydock remained below, watching with arms crossed. Miss Marple's gaze drifted, instead, to the opposite end of the hall where a door stood slightly ajar, the door to the study, if memory served. She had passed it earlier and recalled the faint smell of leather and dust. Now she caught another scent altogether, polish, fresh, sharp, unmistakable. Someone had been generous with it. Edith moved suddenly, as if drawn by an invisible thread, a step toward the stairs before catching herself. Lady Alderney shot her a sharp look. Edith flushed and retreated, folding her hands tightly. Inspector Slack descended at last, his expression no longer neutral. "This may not be as straightforward as it first appeared," he said. "The polish on the landing is uneven, freshly applied in places, thinner in others." Mrs. Price Ridley clucked her tongue. "I told you it was dangerous." "Yes," Inspector Slack replied dryly, "but dangerous doesn't explain everything." He gestured to the constable, who made another note. "We'll need to speak to whoever polished the stairs. And I'd like to know why the landing looks as though it was done twice." A faint ripple of unease passed through the room. Miss Marple felt it like a change in temperature. "That would have been the maids," Lady Alderney said quickly. Under Edith's supervision, all eyes turned once again to Edith. She lifted her chin. "Yes, we polished them yesterday afternoon, and again this morning before the tour." "Why twice?" Inspector Slack asked. Edith hesitated. "There were marks, footprints from moving furniture. Lady Alderney wanted them perfect." Miss Marple watched Lady Alderney's face as Edith spoke, the slightest tightening at the corners of the mouth, the barest flicker of something like irritation or fear. Inspector Slack nodded slowly. "Very well, we'll talk more shortly." As he moved away, conversation surged back, richer now with new material. Uneven polish, twice done. Perfect stairs turned treacherous. Miss Marple returned to her seat and set her teacup aside, untouched now. She thought of the vase, nudged from its place, of the scent of polish drifting from the study, of the way Edith had looked not at the body but at Lady Alderney. In villages, she reflected, people polished things not merely to make them shine, but to erase traces of use, of movement, of presence. Yet no matter how carefully one worked, there was always a moment when a foot slipped, or a hand reached too late, and the truth left its mark all the same. The house seemed to settle into a strained politeness as the afternoon wore on, the sort that followed an interruption too grave to ignore, but too uncomfortable to discuss openly. Inspector Slack established himself in the drawing-room with the constable, summoning people one by one, while the rest of the village waited in the hall or on the terrace, their voices subdued, their glances sharp. Miss Marple remained where she was most easily overlooked, seated near a small window that looked onto the side garden. From there she could see the comings and goings without appearing to watch them. She knitted a little, then stopped, then began again, the rhythm soothing not only to herself, but to those who glanced her way and dismissed her as harmless. Edith was called in first. She returned some time later with a face carefully smoothed into neutrality, though her eyes betrayed a lingering strain. She went straight to Lady Alderney's side, bending slightly as if to ask whether there was anything she could do. Lady Alderney shook her head curtly, her gaze fixed ahead. The small rejection seemed to wound Edith more than the questioning had. Mrs. Price Ridley followed, emerging with an expression of vivid animation, as though she had enjoyed the experience far more than was decent. Perfectly reasonable questions, she announced to anyone within earshot. Very thorough. Exactly what one would expect. Colonel Hardwick came out next, stiff-backed and indignant. "Waste of time," he muttered, though he lowered his voice when he caught Inspector Slack's eye, as if I'd missed something like that. Miss Marple's attention drifted to the study door again. It was open now, wider than before, and she could see the edge of a desk, the gleam of leather-bound books. A maid slipped in and out, carrying a tray of empty cups, her movements careful, almost exaggerated in their quiet. As she passed the study, she hesitated, then nudged the door a little farther closed with her foot. Miss Marple rose slowly and moved closer, her steps unhurried. She paused before the door as though drawn by idle curiosity. Inside, the study was neat to the point of severity. Papers lay squared on the desk, pens aligned. The scent of polish was stronger here, layered over the older smells of ink and leather. "Looking for somewhere to sit, miss?" the maid asked nervously from behind her. "Oh, no, thank you," Miss Marple replied kindly. "I was only admiring the room. Such a comforting place for thought." The maid smiled weakly and hurried away. Miss Marple's gaze fell to the floor just inside the doorway. It gleamed as brightly as the stairs, though one could see the faint swirl marks left by vigorous polishing. Near the threshold was a small dark speck, almost invisible against the shine. She bent slightly, peering, then straightened again without touching it. Behind her, voices rose in the hall. Inspector Slack had emerged, and with him Mr. Hartley, who looked unsettled despite his usual air of theatrical confidence. "Where exactly were you when you last saw Mr. Pritchard?" Inspector Slack was asking. "Near the portraits," Mr. Hartley replied, gesturing vaguely. "We were discussing the Alderney collection. He was very interested in a miniature." And then I suppose he went toward the stairs. I didn't follow him." Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. "You suppose?" Mr. Hartley colored. "I mean, one doesn't track every movement, Inspector." "No," Inspector Slack agreed, "but sometimes movements matter." He dismissed Mr. Hartley and turned, his gaze sweeping the room. It paused briefly on Miss Marple, then moved on. She had the distinct impression he was beginning to notice the pattern of her prints, without quite understanding it. Lady Alderney was called next. She entered the drawing-room with dignity intact, but when she emerged, her composure had thinned. She moved directly to the side table and poured herself a glass of sherry with a hand that shook just enough to be seen. Edith hovered nearby, then retreated again, as if unsure of her place. Miss Marple approached Lady Alderney with gentle concern. "Such a shock," she said softly. "Houses feel different after something like this." Lady Alderney stiffened, then sighed. "Yes, they do. One thinks one knows every corner, and then one realizes that are corners one hasn't looked at in years," Miss Marple finished kindly. Lady Alderney stared at her, a flash of irritation crossing her face. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, only that old houses collect stories," Miss Marple said. "They settle into the woodwork." She moved away before Lady Alderney could reply, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than words. The constable appeared and quietly cordoned off the study, adding it to the growing list of forbidden spaces. This caused a stir. "The study?" Mrs. Price Ridley whispered loudly. "What on earth could that have to do with it?" Inspector Slack addressed the room. "We're expanding our inquiry. Mr. Pritchard had access to several rooms this morning. We're establishing his movements." Edith's face went pale. "He was with Lady Alderney most of the time." "Not all of it," Inspector Slack said evenly. "There was a gap. About 15 minutes. Lady Alderney bristled. "That's absurd. He was examining the gallery." "And who showed him there?" "I did." Inspector Slack held her gaze. "Then you'll understand why we'll need to confirm that." The tension in the room tightened further, like a wire drawn too far. Miss Marple watched Edith closely. The young woman's hands moved again, rubbing thumb against forefinger in a small, repetitive motion, as though polishing something invisible. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun, dimming the light in the hall. The staircase lost some of its shine, becoming merely wood once more, but the dull scuff on the landing remained stubbornly visible, a mark that refused to disappear. Miss Marple returned to her bench and sat, folding her hands. She had seen such moments before, when a village began to sense that its tidy explanations were fraying. The obvious accident no longer fit quite so neatly. Too many small adjustments had been made, stairs polished twice, rooms scrubbed, vases nudged, doors quietly closed. People, she reflected, were very good at cleaning up after themselves, but they were less skilled at noticing what cleaning left behind. By late afternoon, the fete on the green had quietly dissolved. The bunting fluttered unattended, and the music that had once drifted toward Hawthorne House faded into an awkward memory. Inside, the house felt overfull despite the thinning crowd, as though the walls themselves were pressing inward to listen. Inspector Slack's methodical progress continued, drawing threads that tightened rather than unraveled. He had the constable sketch a rough plan of the ground floor, noting doors, corridors, and the narrow passage that connected the study to the gallery. Each line on the paper seemed to carry weight. Miss Marple watched from her bench, her eyes half-lidded, her posture suggesting drowsiness. It was a posture that invited people to speak freely around her. Mrs. Price Ridley perched on the edge of a chair nearby, her voice lowered but persistent. "I always say," she confided to no one in particular, "that secrets rot houses from the inside. All that polishing, it's unnatural." Mrs. Bantry made a non-committal sound, glancing anxiously toward the drawing room. "Do be careful, dear." The inspector. "Oh, I'm not accusing anyone," Mrs. Price Ridley said brightly, "just observing." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. Observation, she thought, was a skill many believed they possessed. Inspector Slack emerged again, his expression more severe now. "I'd like to speak to the staff once more," he announced, individually. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. The maids were summoned one by one, their faces pale, their hands roughened by work and worry. They answered questions in hushed voices about polishing schedules, about who had been where, about whether anyone had spilled anything on the stairs that morning. Their answers overlapped in places and contradicted in others, not from deceit, Miss Marple judged, but from fear and haste. One maid mentioned the gallery door being open when it was usually kept closed. Another recalled seeing Mr. Pritchard near the study, though she could not be sure of the time. A third insisted she had smelled Polish again shortly before the scream, stronger than it should have been. Inspector Slack listened without comment, his pen moving steadily. Edith was called back in. She stood straight this time, as if bracing herself. "I've already told you everything," she said quietly. "Perhaps," Inspector Slack replied, "but things have a way of sounding different the second time." He asked about the 15-minute gap again. Edith repeated her earlier explanation, her words precise, rehearsed. Mr. Pritchard had been examining the gallery. Lady Hawthorne had stepped away briefly to greet guests. Edith had gone to fetch documents from the study. "And did you find them?" Inspector Slack asked. "Yes." "Did Mr. Pritchard come with you?" "No." Inspector Slack's gaze sharpened. "Are you certain?" Edith's fingers moved. Rub, check, wipe thumb, brushing the edge of her cuff, then smoothing it again. "Yes." Miss Marple noticed Lady Hawthorne watching Edith now with an intensity that bordered on hostility. When Edith was dismissed, Lady Hawthorne turned away abruptly, as though the sight were unbearable. As the questioning paused, Miss Marple rose and made her way slowly toward the window. Gazing out at the side garden where shadows lengthened among the hedges, she spoke without turning. "It's remarkable," she said gently, "how people forget the sound of their own footsteps." Inspector Slack glanced at her. "What do you mean by that, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing of consequence," she replied, as though surprised to have been heard. "Only that polished floors are terribly unforgiving. They remember every step." Inspector Slack studied her for a moment, then nodded curtly and returned to his notes. The constable approached, whispering something in his ear. Inspector Slack frowned and crossed the hall to the study door. Unlocking it briefly, he returned holding a small cloth, folded carefully. "This was found near the desk," he said. polishing cloth. Still damp. Lady Alderney's face drained of colour. That's absurd. The study was done yesterday. Inspector Slack's voice was calm. The cloth suggests otherwise. Silence fell. Edith's breathing quickened, barely audible. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward, eyes bright. "And there's something else," the inspector continued. "Mr. Pritchard's shoe soles were clean, no wax residue, which suggests he did not step on the stairs immediately after polishing." Dr. Haydock frowned, meaning someone else did, meaning Inspector Slack said that the stairs were polished again after Mr. Pritchard was already in the house. Miss Marple felt the shift then, subtle but unmistakable. The accident theory sagged under its own weight. Lady Alderney spoke sharply. "Are you implying—" "I'm implying," Inspector Slack interrupted gently, "that someone took pains this morning, pains that may have contributed to a man's death." Edith swayed slightly, catching herself on the back of a chair. Her hand went to her wrist now, rubbing, checking, wiping, as though something there irritated her skin. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the motion. She had seen such habits before, growing worse as pressure mounted. The light in the hall dimmed further as evening approached. Lamps were lit, their glow softer, less forgiving than daylight. The polished stairs gleamed once more, but now the shine felt accusatory rather than impressive. Miss Marple returned to her seat, folding her hands over her bag. The village, she knew, would soon turn its gaze inward, measuring neighbors against new possibilities. People would begin to wonder not who had slipped, but who had hurried and why. And somewhere in that wondering lay the truth, waiting patiently for someone to notice the smallest thing out of place. Evening settled fully over Hawthorne House, bringing with it the uneasy calm that followed too many unanswered questions. Lamps cast soft pools of light across the hall, leaving corners in shadow, and the polished stairs reflected the glow in long, distorted bands. The body had been removed at last, carried away with a care that felt ceremonial rather than medical, and yet the emptiness at the foot of the staircase seemed louder than the presence had been. Inspector Slack remained tireless and increasingly exact. He had dismissed most of the villagers, instructing them to remain nearby while keeping back a smaller group whose movements that morning overlapped in ways he found interesting. Miss Marple was among those retained, though she suspected this was less from suspicion than from his growing sense that she noticed things others did not. Tea was replaced with sherry. Voices dropped further. Truths, when they came, would come quietly. Inspector Slack stood near the side table, consulting his notes. "We've established that Mr. Pritchard entered the house shortly after 11. He was seen in the drawing room, the gallery, and possibly the study. He died sometime after noon." "And the polishing?" Mrs. Price Ridley asked eagerly, unable to restrain herself. "The stairs were polished at least twice," Inspector Slack replied. "Once yesterday afternoon, once again this morning, and then, it appears, a third time on the landing only." Edith flinched. Lady Alderney's lips pressed into a thin line. "The cloth found in the study," Inspector Slack continued, "was damp with fresh polish. Someone used it shortly before the incident." "That proves nothing," Lady Alderney said sharply. "The staff are always polishing." "Yes," Inspector Slack agreed, "but not usually in the study and not during a fete." Miss Marple watched Edith. The young woman's hands were restless now, rubbing at her wrist, then smoothing the front of her skirt, then returning to her wrist again. The skin, though, was beginning to redden, the motion no longer subtle but compulsive. Colonel Hardwicke spoke suddenly. "Are you suggesting one of the staff deliberately made the stairs slippery?" "I'm suggesting," Inspector Slack replied evenly, "that someone wanted them particularly dangerous." A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Bantry drew a sharp breath. Mr. Hartley shifted his weight, glancing instinctively toward the stairs as if measuring their distance. "Mr. Pritchard had enemies?" Inspector Slack asked. "Enemies?" Lady Alderney echoed. "Of course not. He was an academic." Inspector Slack raised an eyebrow. "Academics quarrel as fiercely as anyone, Lady Alderney. Sometimes more so." Edith spoke before she seemed to realize she was doing so. "He wasn't here just for the gallery. The room stilled. All eyes turned to her. What do you mean? Inspector Slack asked gently. Edith swallowed. Her fingers rubbed her wrist again, harder now. He was interested in some papers. Old family papers. He said they might prove something. Lady Alderney's face hardened. That's enough, Edith. Inspector Slack did not look away from Edith. Prove what? Edith hesitated, her gaze flicking to Lady Alderney, then dropping to the floor. I don't know. He wouldn't say, only that it concerned the Alderney inheritance. Mrs. Price Ridley gasped softly, delighted despite herself. Lady Alderney rose. This is nonsense. Idle speculation. Perhaps, Inspector Slack said, but Mr. Pritchard was last seen near the study where family papers are kept, and the study was recently polished. The implication hung in the air. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Inheritance disputes, she said mildly, as if discussing weather patterns. They do have a way of stirring up old feelings. People begin to hurry, to tidy things that might better be left untouched. Inspector Slack glanced at her. Are you suggesting motive, Miss Marple? Oh, no, she replied. Only temperament. Lady Alderney's voice trembled. Now, you're all forgetting something. He fell. There's no proof anyone touched him. No, Inspector Slack agreed, but falls have causes. He turned to Edith again. You said you went to the study to fetch documents. Did Mr. Pritchard know you were going there? Yes. Did he follow you? No. Inspector Slack paused. Yet you were not surprised to find him near the stairs later. Edith's breathing quickened. People move about. Yes, Inspector Slack said quietly. They do. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the staircase once more. She imagined the sequence as clearly as if she had witnessed it, the fresh polish on the landing, applied hastily, the scuff of a shoe, dull, into the shine, the vase nudged aside to make room for someone to pass, the sudden loss of balance, the instinctive reach for the banister. Inspector, she said gently, may I ask something? Inspector Slack inclined his head. The banister, Miss Marple continued. Was it polished as well? Dr. Haydock frowned. I don't believe so. Inspector Slack nodded no. Only the steps and the landing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. How very sensible. One wouldn't want to remove the one thing that might save someone. There was a silence, sharper than before. Inspector Slack's gaze sharpened. You think someone expected him to reach for it? I think, Miss Marple said softly, that someone knew he would. Edith made a small broken sound. Her hand went to her wrist again, rubbing so hard now that the skin was raw. I didn't mean, she began, then stopped. Lady Alderney turned on her. You foolish girl. Inspector Slack held up a hand. Careful, Lady Alderney. Edith's eyes filled, but her voice steadied. He threatened her, she said suddenly. Mr. Pritchard. He said he would expose things, ruin everything. Lady Alderney's composure cracked. That is a lie. Edith shook her head. He said the papers proved you had no right to the estate, that it should have passed to someone else. Mrs. Price Ridley could hardly contain herself. Good gracious. Inspector Slack spoke quietly. And what did you do, Edith? Edith's hands trembled violently now. I cleaned, she said. I always clean when I'm frightened. Miss Marple felt a pang of pity. She had seen it before, small habits swelling under pressure until they betrayed their owner. You polished the landing, Inspector Slack said. Yes, Edith whispered. I thought if he slipped, if it looked like an accident. Lady Alderney sank back into her chair, stunned. But you didn't push him, Inspector Slack said. No, Edith cried. I never touched him. He argued with Lady Alderney. He stormed out. He took the stairs too fast. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. It was all there now, the hurried polish, the scuffed landing, the missed banister. Inspector Slack exhaled slowly. We'll need to hear this formally. Edith nodded, tears spilling at last. I never meant to kill him. Miss Marple watched her, hands folded, heart heavy. Villages, she reflected, were full of people who did terrible things not out of cruelty but out of fear, and who polished their fear until it shone. hoping no one would notice where they had stepped. Edith's words did not bring relief so much as a new, uneasy stillness, the kind that settled when a room sensed it had reached the wrong conclusion too quickly. Inspector Slack did not rush to fill the silence. He had learned, through long practice, that people often hurried to close a story because open endings frightened them. Fear makes people careless, he said at last, but it also makes them inventive. Edith wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, then rubbed at her wrist again, as though the skin there were the source of all her distress. I told you what happened. You told me what you believe happened. Inspector Slack replied. Those aren't always the same thing. Lady Alderney had not spoken since Edith's outburst. She sat very straight, hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed in a way that suggested long training rather than calm. Miss Marple watched her closely. Grief had a shape, and this was not it. Inspector Slack turned to Dr. Haydock. Time of death? Shortly after noon, the doctor said, within a narrow window. And the argument? The inspector asked, looking at Lady Alderney. Lady Alderney lifted her chin. There was no argument. Edith let out a small, incredulous laugh. You shouted at him. I raised my voice, Lady Alderney snapped. Because he was being impertinent. Because he was threatening you, Edith said quietly. Inspector Slack raised a hand. Enough. Let's be precise. Who last saw Mr. Pritchard alive? There was a pause. Then Colonel Hardwicke cleared his throat. I saw him near the stairs, he said, just before the scream. Inspector Slack turned to him. Earlier you said you saw no one near him. I didn't, the colonel replied stiffly. Not then. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the colonel's shoes, still faintly dulled at the edges. She thought of the scuffed mark on the landing and of how some men were always convinced that standing guard meant see everything. Inspector Slack nodded. So you were close? Yes. And you heard nothing? No. Inspector Slack paced slowly, stopping near the side table with the vase. This vase was moved, he said casually. Do you know why? Lady Alderney's gaze sharpened. Because people were milling about. Things get disturbed. Perhaps, Inspector Slack said. Or perhaps someone needed space to pass. Edith's breath hitched. He came out of the study, she said suddenly. I remember now. I heard the door. Inspector Slack turned back to her. You said you didn't see him. I didn't, Edith said desperately. But I heard him. He was angry. His footsteps were fast. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Fast footsteps sound very different on polished wood, she said gently. They're lighter, slippery. Inspector Slack regarded her with new respect. And you notice that? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I've lived long enough to know when someone is in a hurry. Inspector Slack looked again at Edith. If Mr. Pritchard was already angry and moving quickly, the polished landing would have made the stairs more dangerous. But it wouldn't explain one thing. What? Edith whispered. The banister, the inspector said. He reached for it, which suggests he realized too late what was happening. Dr. Haydock nodded. A reflex. Inspector Slack continued. But if someone had wanted to ensure a fall, they'd polish everything, including the banister. Miss Marple felt the shift then, subtle but decisive. Eyes turned again toward the stairs, toward the smooth, untouched rail. You said you cleaned when frightened, Inspector Slack went on. But you cleaned selectively. Edith stared at him. I didn't think, no, Inspector Slack agreed. You didn't think like someone planning a death, you thought. Like someone trying to make something disappear. Lady Alderney's composure cracked at last. This is absurd, she said, her voice trembling. You're tormenting her. Inspector Slack turned to her slowly. You knew Mr. Pritchard intended to challenge the inheritance. Lady Alderney did not answer. And you argued with him. I told him he was mistaken, and when he left the study, angry, you followed him, Inspector Slack said quietly. That's a lie. Miss Marple spoke before the inspector could reply. The vase, she said. It was moved away from the banister, not knocked aside in panic. Placed carefully, Lady Alderney's eyes flicked to the vase, then back again. The smallest betrayal of awareness. Inspector Slack nodded. Someone needed room. someone taller than Edith. The room felt suddenly very small. Colonel Hardwick shifted his stance. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting," Inspector Slack said, "that Edith polished the landing out of habit." Fearful, yes, but she didn't push anyone. Edith shook her head violently. "I never touched him." "No," Inspector Slack agreed, "but someone else did." Lady Alderney rose abruptly. "You can't possibly." Inspector Slack held up a hand. "Mr. Pritchard threatened you. You followed him to the stairs. You grabbed for him, perhaps his sleeve, perhaps his arm. Not to kill him, to stop him." Lady Alderney's lips parted, then closed again. "And in doing so," Inspector Slack continued, "you startled him. On a freshly polished landing, he slipped." "No," Lady Alderney whispered. "He lost his balance." "And you moved the vase," Miss Marple said softly, "to make room. Afterwards, you let Edith believe her cleaning had done it. She already blamed herself." Edith looked at Lady Alderney now with dawning horror. "You let me." "I was protecting the house," Lady Alderney cried. "Everything my family built, by letting someone else carry the guilt," Inspector Slack said. Lady Alderney's shoulders sagged. "I didn't mean for him to die." "No one ever does," Miss Marple murmured. Inspector Slack exhaled slowly. "We'll need to take you in, Lady Alderney." There was no dramatic collapse, no cry for mercy. Lady Alderney simply closed her eyes, the weight of years pressing down at last. Edith sank into a chair, sobbing now, her hands finally still. As the constable stepped forward, Miss Marple looked once more at the stairs, at the shine that had promised beauty and delivered harm. In villages, she reflected, people often believed accidents were kinder than truth. Yet truth, once seen, was gentler in the end, for it allowed the living to stop polishing their fear and begin at last to heal. The house seemed to release a breath it had been holding for years. Lady Alderney was led away quietly, her dignity intact only because she refused to let it fracture in public. The constable closed the door behind her with a careful hand, as though sound itself might bruise what remained of the afternoon. For a long moment no one spoke. Edith sat very still, her shoulders rounded inward, as if she were trying to make herself smaller than the truth. Her hands lay in her lap now, red and raw at the wrist, the old habit finally stilled by exhaustion. Mrs. Bantry hovered near her, offering a handkerchief without comment. Edith took it and nodded once, grateful but unable to speak. Inspector Slack returned to the hall and addressed those who remained. His voice had softened, the edge worn down by the inevitability of what followed understanding. "This matter will be handled properly," he said. "Statements will be taken. In the meantime, I suggest you all go home." There was no protest. The villagers moved with subdued efficiency, coats fetched, murmured goodbyes exchanged. Some glanced toward Miss Marple with a curiosity that bordered on awe, others with a faint unease, as though they had glimpsed something in her they would rather forget. She accepted it with equanimity. Villagers always preferred their wisdom discreet. Dr. Haydock lingered near the door. "You were right," he said to her quietly. "About the banister," Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I merely wondered why someone would take such care with one thing and not another." He shook his head. "I don't know how you do it." She considered. "Practice," she said. "And a great many teacups." As the last of the villagers departed, the hall felt cavernous. Lamps still glowed, but their light no longer softened the shadows, it merely revealed them. Inspector Slack returned, removing his hat and setting it carefully on the side table. "I owe you my thanks," he said. "You noticed what the rest of us stepped around." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "You would have found it yourself. Perhaps," he allowed, "but you found it sooner." He glanced toward the staircase. "Accidents are tidy explanation. They don't ask much of anyone." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but they rarely account for motive." Inspector Slack hesitated. "Edith will be all right." In time, Miss Marple said, "She believed she was responsible because she was frightened. That's a heavy thing to carry alone." Inspector Slack nodded, and Lady Alderney, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the closed door. "She spent a lifetime guarding appearances. It's difficult to stop guarding them, even when there's nothing left to protect." The inspector sighed. Human nature again. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "It's wonderfully consistent." Outside, the last light faded from the sky, leaving Alderney House outlined against the dark. Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and rose. "I think I'll walk home," she said. "Fresh air is good after polished rooms." Inspector Slack smiled faintly, of course. As she stepped onto the path, the cool evening wrapped around her like a benediction. The village lay quiet, its windows lit, its secrets drawn in for the night. She walked slowly, allowing the events of the day to settle into their proper place. She thought of Edith, cleaning in fear, rubbing at her wrist until the skin burned. Of Lady Alderney, standing between past and future, choosing control over compassion. Of Mr. Pritchard, moving too quickly, too confidently, never imagining that Polish could betray him. At the corner she paused, looking back once at the darkened house. In the end, she reflected, it had not been the stairs alone that killed him, nor even the shove that startled him. It had been the belief that surfaces mattered more than people, that shine could substitute for honesty. She turned toward home, her steps steady, her mind already easing away from tragedy toward tomorrow's small concerns, letters to answer, roses to prune, knitting to finish. Life would resume its pattern, as it always did, though altered in ways only those who paid attention would notice. And in St. Mary Mead, for a long while yet, people would tread more carefully on polished floors, listening perhaps for the first time to the sound of their own footsteps. The days that followed settled into St. Mary Mead with the peculiar weight of something both concluded and unresolved. News travelled quickly, though it softened as it moved, losing its sharper edges to careful phrasing and lowered voices. By the time it reached the far end of the village, Mr. Pritchard's death had become that unfortunate business at Alderney House, and Lady Alderney's arrest was spoken of with a mix of disbelief and reluctant acceptance. Miss Marple observed it all from her usual places, the post office queue, the church path after evensong, the small tables at the Blue Boar where tea was poured with a little more solemnity than before. People glanced at her now with a new awareness, as though she had been quietly rearranged in their minds. She accepted this too. Attention, like Polish, wore thin if applied too often. Edith did not return to Alderney House. She stayed for a few days with Mrs. Bantry, emerging pale but composed, her hands kept carefully folded as if she feared what they might do on their own. The habit remained rub, check, wipe, but it had slowed. The urgency dulled into something more manageable. Miss Marple visited her once, bringing scones and no question. "I keep thinking," Edith said, staring into her teacup, "that if I hadn't polished—" Miss Marple interrupted gently. "If you hadn't polished, something else would have been blamed. Guilt has a way of finding the nearest empty place." Edith looked up, startled. "You don't think it was my fault?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that you did what frightened people often do. You tried to make things neat." Edith nodded, tears slipping free at last. Miss Marple let them fall without comment. The house itself was closed, its windows shuttered, its steps dull now under a film of neglect. No one volunteered to clean them. Even the children who dared each other to peek through the gates kept their distance from the stairs, as though shine itself had become suspect. Inspector Slack returned briefly to complete formalities. He called on Miss Marple before leaving, standing in her sitting room with an expression that suggested unfinished thoughts. "You know," he said, "she might not have meant to kill him. The courts will decide how that matters." Miss Marple poured tea. "Intention explains behavior," she said. "It doesn't undo it." Inspector Slack accepted his cup. "And Edith?" "She'll heal," Miss Marple replied. "People do when they're no longer afraid of the wrong thing." He smiled faintly. "You've a remarkable way of putting things." She inclined her head. Years of listening. After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting untouched. She thought of Lady Alderney in a cell somewhere, surrounded by walls she could not polish into submission. Of Mr. Pritchard's papers, now catalogued, their revelations reduced to legal language. Of how easily a village accepted a tidy story and how reluctantly it embraced the messier truth. Sunday came, and with it church. The congregation filled the pews, though gaps remained where certainty once sat. The vicar spoke of humility, and the dangers of pride, his words careful, his eyes avoiding familiar faces. Miss Marple listened, her thoughts drifting not to doctrine but to the small gestures she had noticed. That day at Hawthorne House, a vase placed just so, a door eased shut, a cloth left damp in a study. Afterward, outside among the gravestones, Mrs. Price Ridley sidled up to her. "Such a shock," she said, her voice hushed but eager. "One never knows what goes on behind closed doors." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but one can often tell by how often the doors are open." Mrs. Price Ridley blinked, then laughed a little too loudly and moved on. As the village resumed its rhythms, Miss Marple felt the familiar settling of perspective. Tragedy did not end things so much as it rearranged them. People returned to habits with slight adjustments, slower steps on stairs, longer pauses before judgment, a cautious respect for what might be hidden beneath a fine shine. One afternoon she walked past Hawthorne House again. The gate stood open now, the path littered with leaves. She paused at the foot of the stairs visible through the hall window. They looked ordinary without their polish, merely worn wood bearing the marks of years. She approved of them more that way. In the end, she reflected, it had not been cleverness that solved the matter, nor even experience. It had been attention to what people did when they thought no one important was watching. Villages were full of such moments, she knew. So were people. She turned away and walked on, already thinking of a letter she must write, a stitch she must correct. Life continued, imperfect and unpolished, and for that she was quietly grateful. Time, as it always did, softened the sharpest edges of what had happened without erasing it entirely. By the time the leaves turned and St. Mary Mead settled into autumn, Hawthorne House no longer felt like a wound, merely a place people avoided without quite knowing why. The gates were closed now, the path left to gather moss, and the staircase once so admired was spoken of only obliquely, as though polish itself had become an indiscretion. Miss Marple returned to her routines with quiet relief. There were letters to answer, roses to prune back before frost, and a pair of socks whose heel required careful mending. These small obligations restored a sense of proportion. They reminded her that life, when attended to properly, consisted less of grand conclusions than of steady continuance. Edith left the village before winter set in. She came to say goodbye on a mild afternoon, her coat neatly buttoned, her hands clasped with conscious care. The habit remained, but it no longer ruled her. When she rubbed her wrist now, she seemed to notice and stop. "I've found a position," Edith said, her voice steadier than Miss Marple had ever heard it. "In a solicitor's office. Nothing grand, but it feels clean." Miss Marple smiled at the word. "I think you'll do very well, you're observant." "That's a rare quality." Edith hesitated. "I wanted to thank you for seeing what I couldn't." "For listening," Miss Marple corrected gently. "You told the truth long before you understood it." Edith nodded, tears bright but contained, and left with a lighter step than she had arrived. Of Lady Hawthorne, news came only occasionally and without detail. The case moved slowly, as such cases did, weighed down by nuance and circumstance. Miss Marple followed it with interest, but not impatience. Justice, she had learned, rarely arrived quickly, but it arrived best when allowed to take its proper shape. One afternoon, Inspector Slack wrote to her. The letter was brief, formal, and carefully worded, yet beneath it lay something like gratitude. He mentioned that the court had accepted a fuller account of events, that responsibility had been assigned where it belonged, and that certain misunderstandings had been corrected. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it in her writing desk. She did not dwell on it. Conclusions were less satisfying than the understanding that preceded them. At church, the following Sunday, the vicar spoke of forgiveness. The congregation listened with polite attention. Though forgiveness, Miss Marple suspected, was easier to admire than to practice. Outside, among the gravestones, Mrs. Bantry linked arms with her. "Things feel different, don't they?" she said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "They usually do, after people stop pretending they're the same." They walked on together, the path crunching underfoot, the air sharp and clean. Later that week, Miss Marple found herself polishing her own hall table. a modest piece that bore the marks of years. She worked carefully, then stopped, stepping back to examine it. The surface gleamed, but not excessively. One could still see the faint scratches beneath the shine, evidence of use rather than neglect. She set the cloth aside and left it at that. It struck her then how often people mistook perfection for virtue. They polished away the signs of living, believing that smoothness equaled goodness. Yet it was the scratches, the small irregularities, that told the truest stories, where someone had leaned, where a hand had rested, where a life had passed close enough to leave a mark. As winter approached, St. Mary Mead grew quieter. Evenings drew in early, and lamps glowed in familiar windows. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting steadily, the rhythm comforting. She thought of the polished stairs and the dull scuff that had betrayed haste, of a vase moved just enough to make room, of fear disguised as tidiness. Human nature, she reflected, rarely changed. People would always tidy what frightened them, polish what they wished to hide, and rush when patience was required. But there would also always be those who noticed the faint mark in the shine, the habit that grew under pressure, the gesture that did not quite fit the story being told. She finished her row and set the knitting aside, listening to the quiet of the house. Outside, the wind moved through the hedges, stirring leaves that no one bothered to gather. They lay where they fell, honest and unarranged. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Order had its place, certainly, but truth, she had learned, did not require polish. It required only attention and the willingness to look at things as they were, not as one wished them to appear. And in that knowledge, gentle and unassuming, she found a kind of peace.